Lara Croft as a character has a rather complicated legacy. She's independent, capable, acrobatic, accomplished, and the main character of her own series rather than simply another member of her surrounding cast like many of her contemporaries. She's not visually obscured like Samus or a narrative tool like Zelda and Peach. She helped break some of the stigma around female protagonists in video games, no doubt making the women who played the Tomb Raider games feel a little more visible. The popularity of the franchise firmly cemented her amongst the wave of influential British culture emerging at the time. As silly as it sounds, Lara Croft is kind of peers with Blur, Oasis, Danny Boyle and Damien Hirst, but as important and true as this all is, it's not the whole truth, because Lara Croft was also a sex object. Gaming magazines used suggestive language to intonate the presumed attraction the reader had to her. An entire book titled Lara Croft and the Art of Virtual Seduction was released. Lara's voice actor, who would answer players' questions in character at conventions, specifically recalls being asked about Croft's body. To put it more succinctly, playground rooms for Pokemon were about if you could catch a Mew. For Tomb Raider, they were about seeing Lara naked. There's a contradiction at play here that, while not invalidating the good her existence has done, undeniably highlights the context under which she was created. Her characterization and the series as a whole was for a long time marred by the influence of heteropatriarchy and the ways in which we appeal to the sexuality of boys, through depersonalizing women and selling them as objects. With the series reboot in 2013 came a new iteration of the character. This Lara seeks to mitigate the tension of the culturally emergent dialectic by making her more grounded, realistic, and practical. It's a logical evolution that effectively lets her exist on her own terms, less defined by how she can be sold to men and more by her ambitions, goals, and skill. Interestingly, those ambitions are to raid tombs and leave her Yakubian fingerprints on the untouched cultures of the world. Which brings us to the second dialectic of the series, one that the reboot trilogy fails to successfully address. The blatant colonialist streak that runs through the series hasn't really become part of Tomb Raider's legacy in the cultural canon. By the mid-1990s, doing colonialism wasn't as subversive as being a woman, I suppose, and Britain had migrated to being quietly and dismissively ashamed of their past, while refusing to actually dismantle and sufficiently reflect on the systems that abetted the things that happened during it. What this means is that culturally, Lara kind of is the series' identity, and so in trying to modernize that identity, more attention has been paid to her than the things she does. This approach is emblematic of the liberal project at large, where the aesthetics of something, the markers of identification you apply to it and the face you give it, prove more important than the core content of it, at least as far as liberalism is concerned. This leaves us with a trilogy, Tomb Raider 2013, Rise of the Tomb Raider and Shadow of the Tomb Raider, that becomes increasingly paranoid over its own character, and the mechanical underpinnings that make addressing its thematic shortcomings practically impossible. In the process, it flails under the pressure, the undercurrent of awareness only making the politics of the game seem more craven and ill-conceived. So what I want to do is go through how each game tries to twist itself out of the colonialist allegations, and in the process leverages identity politics to inadequately sweep it all under the rug. As much as these three games like to take pride in Lara's status as a strong woman, it's the rest of her identity that makes these games so uncomfortable at times. She's white, British, incredibly rich, and on a mission to explore the unknown. She's also following in the footsteps of her father, an archaeologist who was killed when she was a child. This personal investment tinges her missions with a selfishness that mirrors the inherent Western chauvinism that colours so much of the British Empire's history. And so when all these things are combined, the series' conceit becomes unavoidably rife with colonialist undertones, really no matter how much you try and distract from them. But boy does Tomb Raider 2013 really try and distract from it. This is apparent right from the start. Lara, with her more measured design, doesn't reflect the ostentatious wealth of her background as much, and apparently according to her backstory actively tries not to use that wealth. She more stumbles into the leading role, acting as a research assistant to a documentarian as they search for Yamatai, an island whose existence is contested. They crash onto the shore and Sam, Lara's friend, is captured in the process, serving as the inciting incident for the narrative. This is the first of many measures the game takes to distance itself from the uncomfortable connotations that the gameplay implicitly invites, and to its credit this first game ends up coming out the cleanest of the three when appraised through the lens of colonialism. Sam's capture and the sheer confluence of circumstances that thrust Lara to the forefront of the adventure add a tinge of inevitability to the constant destruction of ages-old artifacts and buildings. Lara herself can't be blamed too much for everything that goes down, she doesn't get much of a choice. Beyond this, there's also the background of the people you mow down. Called the Solari Brotherhood, they're ripe to be painted as savage natives who have absurd beliefs and a cruel culture. Much of that proves to be true, except that they're not natives at all, but rather the survivors of previous shipwrecks, which I suppose are common due to the constant severe storms surrounding the island. This isn't a perfect solution. The Solari quite easily resemble all the disgusting ways in which indigenous people trying to defend themselves from invaders have been unfairly portrayed in the past. It's just that this time, that central detail, the status of them as native people, has been sidestepped. Possibly the most interesting aspect to the narrative of this game though, is the fact that the beliefs of Solari leader Matthias and the rest of the Brotherhood are completely affirmed. Their hope to revive the Sun Queen Himiko using Sam as a vessel doesn't materialize as the inane, improbable beliefs of the people of some strange land, as is so typical in these types of stories. Instead, we see that by the end of the game the ritual is taking place and is working. An insane man wanting to resurrect a god using the body of the most important person in your life is still bad, so Lara has to stop him, but by allowing this spiritual, othered belief system to be rooted in some truth, the game doesn't draw such a hard line between perspectives. Lara and her outlook, which is coloured by her background, is still painted as the correct, more moral one, but at the very least all other views aren't being written off completely. As such, there's some wiggle room given here, where the game clearly thinks the Solari are insane, rather than just other types of people in general. And so Tomb Raider 2013 does a pretty decent job of taking a wide berth around colonialist illusions, at least narratively, because while the details of this story have been plotted with the intention to create that wide berth, gameplay misses the memo and crashes right through the troubling implications. Mechanically, Tomb Raider is intense, cerebral, and incredibly violent, and this is where Lara's identity specifically comes into play. It is an empowering story on some level. You play as a woman who almost single-handedly takes down a cult comprised entirely of men in an effort to save someone she cares about, and that person is a man or a child. It is very literally about preventing the stripping away of a woman's autonomy and control, which is great. Not to mention the queer subtext of Sam and Lara's relationship, though this was never built on as Sam disappears from the series after this game. Maybe the developers were scared of making a character choice that was too compelling and subversive and good. So all these details work together to create a narrative that I'd say is actively feminist, even if it's not too complex, rather than passively affirming as it had been in the past. But at the same time, the content of gameplay rears its head amongst this. Yes, the story is about preserving a woman's agency. It's also one where Lara lands on a foreign land, destroys everything that sits upon its surface, and then leaves again back to her mansion, albeit with some pretty severe PTSD. The gameplay of this story involves committing mass murder, killing the fauna of Yamatai, and essentially looting it for valuable artifacts. The pillaging of this island has been gamified and systematized to create fun and satisfaction, and most importantly, individual empowerment, via a simultaneous arc around the player's own ability and Lara's growing prowess reflected in the upgrade system. And this is how we get a specifically liberal colonialism. Tomb Raider 2013 is by many counts a progressive game and one that puts in a fair amount of effort to wash its hands of the connotations inherent to it, but all the while it's content to indulge in the aesthetic markers of how colonialism is justified and rationalized. As I mentioned, there's a base superiority in the portrayal of Lara and her way of life that may be subversive under the context of patriarchy, but is all too familiar under the context of Western expansionism and white supremacy more broadly. This is not to say the game or the people who worked on it are actively racist, but it does show how a story built primarily out of the perspectives of people who weren't colonized and who live in the Imperial core can so easily replicate many of the tropes and aesthetic overtures that actively racist and/or colonialist stories purposefully indulge in. Rise of the Tomb Raider seems acutely aware of this, seeing as it shifts the story to a very white part of the world ethnically, and environmentally too actually. There's a fuckload of snow in this game. It takes place in Siberia, where Lara and Jonah believe they may find the divine source, which promises immortality, and the hidden city it lies in called Katesh. They're not the only ones who are after the artifact, however. Trinity, an ages-old order of knights turned paramilitary group, and the ones behind Lara's dad's death, is also hoping to find the secret to immortality so that Trinity commander Constantine can use it to save his sister Anna's life, who also was in a relationship with Richard Croft after Lara's mother died when she was young. Now that's a lot of names and interconnecting relationships, but it folds into the earlier point I briefly covered, where Lara's interpersonal drama is used as a justification for her exploits. Of course, within the game's world, Trinity pose a threat, but you so rarely get a conception of the world removed from Lara, and so you're left with the impression that if she and her father before her had just learned to keep shit to themselves, the entire world would not be under threat from this shadowy force. It's hard to have much sympathy for her because she's pretty directly tied to the violence delivered unto the people you come across in Siberia, part of an ancient tribe called the Remnants. Beyond that, Lara comes across as unbelievably naive. It seems farcical that someone so dedicated to studying history and legends could not see how a tool like immortality would maybe be best left hidden. I point this frustrating character writing out because it thins the base of charity you afford Lara and the things she does. Tomb Raider 2013 definitely has its problems, but the scenario has been thoroughly written to make the reactions she has to her circumstances understandable and to some extent unavoidable. Rise of the Tomb Raider, by making her mission one she seeks out rather than falls into, adds a level of intention to what she does. This colours the colonialist aspects of this game, so let's actually get into them. The first of two dodges you see is that, like I mentioned, the indigenous people you come across are now all white because the game takes place in Siberia. Generally speaking, we don't see Russia and its people as racialized, despite much of the country's landmass residing in Asia, and so there's just less inherent baggage by focusing the narrative here. Despite this effort to sidestep the framing of Lara as a white saviour, she nevertheless comes across this group of people who've lived here for many centuries and basically schools them on what they need to do to survive. As the player, you naturally have the most significant role in defending them, and while not portrayed as incompetent, the remnants are still being protected and saved primarily by this outsider, who to her credit is trying to stop Trinity, but is also trying to deal with her own trauma around what happened in Yamatai and with her family, and so her assistance can come off as self-serving and ultimately dangerous to these people she purportedly wants to protect. Again, we see the tacitly superior perspective of Lara as a rich white person from a colonial empire, proving to be what's needed to help these native people. The other major dodge implemented as part of Rise of the Tomb Raider's wrestling with its own optics is to create an equivalency between the Soviet Union and Trinity. You find notes and audio recordings all over the Siberian landscape which do discuss matters of oppression and quasi-imperialism, specifically towards ethnic minorities and indigenous Siberians, so there's a clear implication that Trinity would do similar. Constantine, although being American, looks quite Eastern European, and when adorned with the red and gold Trinity insignias is clearly meant to evoke the USSR. The reason I bring this up is that it feels pretty deliberate, specifically that the game only comments on these ideas in relation to Trinity and, more broadly speaking, a force that's antagonistic to Lara and by extension her lineage and what she represents, in this case Britain or the Western capitalist world generally. This is not to downplay what the game discusses in this regard. I don't know tons about Siberia, but I'm briefly aware of the resistance indigenous Siberians put up against Russian conquest from the 1500s through the 1700s, and the deportations of ethnic minorities to remote places like Siberia is one of the most egregious mistakes cited by even Marxist-Leninists about the Soviet Union. So I'm not trying to say the game is unfair to Russia and its history here or deny that history, but I do think it's pretty conveniently shifting blame. The game's going out of its way to essentially invent this antagonist so it can talk about conquest and colonialism without having to confront the player and their preconceptions. And the easiest way to do this is to subtly imply that the villains are communists. This implication isn't built out of the villain's stated ambitions in regards to a mode of production. There's no material basis for the comparison. It's instead built out of the larger cultural assumption, born from decades of propaganda, that communism is this inherently evil, unacceptable iron fist of a system that crushes all who oppose it. This is then, through Lara and her role, naturally juxtaposed with the freedom and moral superiority that liberal democracy and capitalism has afforded her, to run around the world saving foreigners with her very big guns. Perhaps this all seems like a reach, but I really don't think so. I mean, obviously I don't think so. I do tend to agree with the opinions I formulate with my brain after all. But the reason I don't think so is because I doubt there's even that much intention behind it. It's just a natural narrative dynamic that arises out of, like in Tomb Raider 2013, the perspectives of the creators. You know, if you want an American to hate someone, just compare them to communists and the little Joseph McCarthy that resides in every US citizen's head will wake up and see red. It's just culturally understood thanks to the Red Scare that communists do the bad things and capitalists do the good things, and that's what Rise of the Tomb Raider taps into so that it can discuss colonialism, rather than reflecting in on itself, because Tomb Raider is a product of capitalism. This makes for a narrative experience that can be thematically compelling at times but still largely unchallenging, and at many points actively frustrating thanks to how obstinate and emotionally disconnected you can feel from Lara. The game is just not very brave narratively, and as a result remains content with the status quo despite the ostensible subversive quality within this reboot series. In step with this is the lessening of focus on Lara's womanhood. Not that the game needs to repeat itself in this regard, but this definitely sticks out more when compared to Shadow of the Tomb Raider. The last entry in the trilogy finally takes the plunge and follows Lara to the global south. While tracking a Trinity unit in Mexico, Lara and Jonah come across Pedro Dominguez, the leader of the whole organization. They trace him to Peru, where the pair find an ancient dagger within a temple. Lara, against Jonah's warning, takes the dagger and literally triggers the apocalypse, which will come in the form of cataclysmic environmental disasters. Dominguez's goal is to use this dagger together with a silver box of his shell to remake the world in his image and so on. We've all seen this motivation many times over. But the real thing I want to focus on here is that Lara triggers the fucking apocalypse via her ignorance and chauvinism. If anything I've said so far has seemed extreme or like reaching, Well, this entire game's premise and inciting incident is clearly referencing the legacy I've been discussing, which is actually quite promising. Maybe the game's actually going to be willing to come to terms with the things Lara's done and how they're politicized. I mean, it sure starts out strong in that regard. Shortly after a confrontation with Dominguez in a Peruvian town, a flood erupts and begins sweeping this previously vibrant community away completely. The set piece has the trademark spectacle of the reboot series, but is more harrowing than exhilarating. As you hear the screams of the town's residents, you can't help but reflect on how this is your fault, and so I was really interested in how the game would build on that. The problem is, it really doesn't. Lara never suffers any meaningful consequences for her actions. Jonah suffers, the people of Peru and later on Paititi, the hidden city which much of the game focuses on, suffer, the world threatens to suffer, but never her specifically. The game attempts to play off this by calling back to her relationship to her parents and emphasizing the isolation and trauma within her life. But this thread has been pulled out again and again, throughout all of Rise of the Tomb Raider and also in a piece of that game's DLC which is about exploring the Croft Manor. This angle has just been worn down so much that it has no impact really, it just slides off. Shadow of the Tomb Raider at points flirts with radicalizing Lara in a way, as though she's finally snapped after losing so much, but it never commits. There are shades of it in a new mechanic where you can disguise yourself with mud. It makes stealth sequences feel really cerebral and instinctual in a way that's quite interesting, but that idea isn't compiled on enough. So you're left with a main character who's really quite deplorable in my opinion. Lara's so obsessed with solving this overarching mystery that she refuses to honestly reflect even when that obsession endangers the entire world. Of course, again, Trinity are a part of this, but they still just feel like a shallow deflection. They've merely been invented by the writers to avoid the hard questions. As such, Lara's characterization and identity arises as a central factor to the game's politics, and helps set the stage for the main contradiction at play. The game is forever trying to reconcile what you've been doing and continue to do in this trilogy with the fact that it clearly wants to be overall more respectful of the cultures it's exploring and diverse amongst the supporting cast. You can now change it so that NPCs all speak in their native language. There's a side quest where you save a little girl from being sacrificed, where after doing so, Lara encourages her to continue her studies. Two of the big new characters, Abby and Unuratu, are both women who are vital to the narrative, with the main plot partly revolving around helping Unuratu ascend to the throne of Paititi after she was usurped by Dominguez. There are also a number of other quests which involve local customs and beliefs that, while possibly seeming fantastical to the player, are affirmed and explored in a way that can be genuinely illuminating. These are clearly all moves to create a more complete picture of these foreign cultures in a way that's not one-dimensional or overly simplistic, which is great, I'm all for it. But they ultimately do come across as rather hollow, because as we know by now, these games mechanically are about violence, plunder, and destruction, and so Shadow of the Tomb Raider finds itself attempting to address colonialism with the politics of representation. It's a liberal fantasy that doesn't hold up to scrutiny, instead only heightening the grotesquerie. Again and again, Lara is shown as endlessly kind and polite to these people. She kneels down to speak to the children of Paititi eye to eye, she wears their traditional dress when walking around the city, she helps them to solve their problems. But at the same time, like in Rise of the Tomb Raider, these foreign cultures which are treated with so much respect, by necessity must compromise and shift to make room for Lara, so she can stroll to the forefront of them all and ultimately exist as the most important person in every situation, because she's the protagonist. Her womanhood feels central to the game and its attempts to justify her role amongst the world the developers have created. Lara's identity becomes shorthand for relatability to subjugated peoples and is leveraged to make it seem like, well, if someone's got to start the apocalypse, at least that person has also been oppressed. Shadow of the Tomb Raider does not say this out loud with words, but it's the impression you get when you actually take the material in its totality. When you properly consider the context, the symbols and imagery used, the language and markers of progressivism that are employed, and most pressingly the moment-to-moment gameplay where you once again shoot, maim, stab, drown, suffocate people, where you slaughter native wildlife for your own gain, where you pilfer who knows how old tombs for their valuables so that you can hear what insight Lara has about these things, not even the people of the culture themselves, but Lara. When you consider all of these things, it's hard not to wince at this trilogy, and feel like even with all the precautions taken, it nevertheless materializes as a reification and acceptance of colonialism and the superstructures that it imposes upon colonized people.
I have to go! I'm the only one!
When you look back upon these three games, you get an interesting arc in regards to their politics. Tomb Raider 2013 holds up the most because of its lack of interest in truly engaging with its own implications. It remains less realistic, more fictitious, and overall easier to suspend disbelief while experiencing. Rise of the Tomb Raider proves to be less successful because of how inadequate its exploration of colonialism is, but at the same time manages to avoid the second dialectic I mentioned earlier regarding Lara and her characterization. though it still sets the series up to fail the most spectacularly with Shadow of the Tomb Raider, where it can become legitimately grotesque in parts, full of the same conquering imagery and gameplay whilst using identity politics to try and distract from it, coming across as rather cynical in the end. And this trend is part of what motivated me to make this video. The evolution of video games as a medium has also coincided with the broader, increasing focus on intellectual property. Everything must be a sequel or reboot as publishers become more and more risk-averse. Games have always had a more malleable concept of continuity within a series because the industry has been so influenced by technology. Look at the shift to 3D, for example. And this relationship has allowed the investment into only established properties to flourish. But at the same time, the games industry has also matured, diversified, and expanded. What was once culturally seen as just an isolating hobby for socially stunted straight white men has over time learned to accommodate for the intersecting, overlapping idea of identity and how an audience may embody that. These differing factors around the market and the industry's evolution have now collided, and so while a Tomb Raider game can change Lara and still retain its sense of self thanks to evolving cultural mores, it can't meaningfully change the thematic focus of gameplay and the illusions that it brings with it. This trilogy is a case study for this unique dynamic. A series of games that can only really push boundaries in a particular direction, a direction that's politically affirming of the systems under which it's produced. To politicize the game in a more fundamental, subversive way would be too bold, too interesting, and too potentially alienating to the largely materially centrist, see liberal, and conservative audience mainstream games target. So naturally this is ruled out by publishers, executives, and the market. Which is why I don't really blame the developers. As I said when talking about Tomb Raider 2013, they still made the thing, so it's not as though they had no control, but I'm sure they also had the best intentions. And it seems like lots of consulting and research was invested in specifically for Shadow of the Tomb Raider, so they clearly weren't trying to create some bastion of pro-colonialist art, but they still managed to do so on some level, however abstract it may be. Despite what bigoted, brain-dead chuds have to say, video games have and always will be political because they're naturally influenced by the material conditions that lead to their creation. And we see with this trilogy how those circumstances can have a very long tail, and how vague ideas like identity and representation, despite still being important, are not equipped to counter and disrupt a seismic force like colonialism on their own. No matter how adept Lara may be at running from the crumbling vestiges of the sacred ancient cultural sites she visits, she never manages to outrun the politicized legacy her identity evokes, even if a feminine face tries to distract from it. Because that legacy isn't skin deep, it's within her core.